தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.
Welcome to CrossRoads on TVI, a show that showcases the Tamil Canadian community, their issues and their successes. I'm your host, Manjula Salvaraja. I just want to say, by the way, that I am somewhat losing my voice. I will try to keep it together till the end of the show. I am in the midst of the flu. The flu was winning yesterday, but it's losing today, I think. My apologies if I lose my voice halfway through. On our show today, we will speak to a panel about caste in the Canadian Tamil diaspora. Then we'll speak to a young documentary filmmaker about her upcoming piece on the color of our skins. We would like to invite you to call us and share your thoughts on anything you hear. Give us a ring at 416-623-8100. We would love to hear from you. Let's meet our guest. Sindhujan Varadaraja is a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science in Race, Ethnicity and Post-Colonial Studies. He works on research at the Institute of Race Relations in London and for Harvard University's Joint Academic Research Network, Euro-Islam. Last year, he conducted a study on caste in the Tamil diaspora, which he presented to the 2012 Tamil Studies Conference in Toronto. Arani Muruganandan is a fourth-year political science student at York University. Though she is still trying to find her way in the world, she tells us, she is thinking of a life in academia focused on women's studies. An avid volunteer at many community organizations, she's here to share her views and some of the experiences people have privately shared with her on this issue. She won't be naming names, but at least to give us an idea of the context of how caste is felt in the diaspora. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. So Sindhujan, I'll start off with you. I think that it'd be important for us to get an understanding of the history of the idea of the caste system. Can you share that with us?
Okay. Well, there's no standardized kind of history which is not contested. So every single narration that has been come up with has so far been contested and challenged by different academics and scholars. So what they've been simplifying it as is that the caste system derives from the Hindu Varna system, the Vedic one. So it stratifies society according to four different castes and one caste that is out of the system, which are the Dalits as well as the Adivasis. And the caste system is said to have evolved amongst the subgroups within the Varna system and has become a system of social control that dictates rules such as interactions with different castes, as well as endogamy, caste rituals and behaviors. And they were ritualized and then codified in the 2nd to the 6th BCE in the Manusmriti, which are the laws of Manu. And the caste system has survived over centuries and through the ideological power of the karma and dharma system of the Hindu philosophy. And it has survived the invasion of Islamic empires, the expansion of Buddhism, the anti-caste Bhakti movement, European colonialism and decolonization, and remain to be part and parcel of the subcontinent's everyday lives. And what is also important about the caste systems for us to understand that caste is not just today an element that affects Hindus on their own, but it's also something that affects today South Asian Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Sikhs alike. And legislative decisions within South Asia to abolish untouchability and to provide affirmative action, such as in India, never actually eliminated the system in itself.
Interesting. Okay. So then let's get to sort of what we're talking about today. Arnie, I'll put this to you first. There seems to be a level of discomfort within just conversations we may have, or even conversations in forums about talking about caste. Why do you think that is?
Personally, I think it's because you're sort of brought up in a culture where you're not really allowed to speak up towards certain things that are uncomfortable. And we obviously know that socially it's not something that you would want to step outside and say, because it's not going to be something that's going to be accepted in a general form, right? But it's an issue that lies internally within a lot of people and a lot of families. So it's kind of undermined, but it exists. And it exists at large, especially when it comes to marriage, when it comes to friendships, when it comes to who we allow in the household, who we don't allow in the household. And even when we're traveling, all of a sudden when we're traveling to, for example, Sri Lanka, right? Like, it's almost a cultural shock for individuals who've never been there, because you're taught not to go into certain areas, and you're told not why people are not even allowed to step into temples, right? So it's almost a really big cultural shock, and it's at that point that you start to question it, right? But then they tell you, no, you can't speak out on this, right? Because it's almost offensive, because you understand that you're almost, well, you are pretty much either eliminating a certain group of individuals, right? And you're categorizing them, which puts them into a position of, like, I'd say deviance, right? Because it's not like, where do you stand and what your perspective is not really valued.
Interesting. That's really interesting that you bring up that idea of the shock that people have when they travel as well. Sindhujan, do you have something to add to that about this idea of discomfort that I've noticed, at least?
There's a lot of that is connected to the idea of social implications that come about when we talk about caste, and what kind of reaction it causes amongst the community. And in a lot of cases, just bringing up the issue would bring discrimination in itself, a stigma, a negative backlash that includes harassment and other forms of intimidation and social silencing. And I also think, like, a couple of reasons for why it is so socially taboo, such a social taboo in our societies, that it in a way illustrates the cleavages within our society, and also the social ruptures and violence that have continuously, like, accompanied our history into our present. And I also think that in a context of being an immigrant, a refugee community in a host society, I think we want to portray a certain kind of idea and image of ourselves, and caste in itself is something that in a Western projection is something that is looked as something backwards, and it would negatively impact on how society itself would deal with us and also, like, look at us. So a lot of people would rather, like, eliminate it from our discourse and silence it and make it and put it into some back corner of it. And I think in many ways also, like, a lot of people do not want to openly associate caste to be part of our culture. In that sense, a lot of people shift responsibilities by basically pinpointing to the much more crude form of caste discrimination and violence that happens in India. And by saying that things are much more worse in India, there's a way of trying to absolve oneself from the cultural and community responsibility towards caste discrimination that is actually happening even within us. So, and then the other reason that I also think is very important for us is that the war in Sri Lanka has also an impact on the diaspora itself, and how it wants to frame itself as a united front, which does not have any kind of factors that make it vulnerable towards social division in terms of how it unites towards the oppressive and genocidal force in Sri Lanka.
That's actually an interesting perspective. So let me ask you this. I mean, in the networks that you guys have come across, do you think people are aware? Let me start with you, Arnie. Do you think people are aware of their caste identity?
Yes and no. For a lot of, it really depends. I think for women, this is just my personal opinion.
Yeah.
I think for women, there's a little more awareness, because when you're falling in love or when you're going out there, your parents sort of portray this and speak to you about this, right? Like, individually, more so. And especially as you get older, that awareness gets larger, because you're at that age where, you want to settle, or, you're out there to find somebody, or you have found somebody, and that topic comes about, right? When they're starting to look into where you're from, and your association to certain individuals, and all that becomes an issue.
It comes into play, you're
exactly,
saying.
yeah. And I think it is out there, and people are aware, but like Sindhujan said, it's not socially accepted, right, within the Western community.
Context,
exactly.
Yeah.
And you're not, obviously it is discrimination, it is harassment, right? And you are undermining individuals, right, at whole, and you're not taught to ever do that. So why now, right? And how now, right? So it exists, but people don't speak about it per se.
So when do you think, so you're saying that in certain segments of society, they are aware, perhaps even from a young age, of their caste identity. Do you think it comes to play in their interactions?
It does, because...
And when do you think it comes into play, without citing specific examples?
I think it does, because you are taught from a very young age that this group of individuals might be like this, or that group of individuals might be like that, right? So all of a sudden, and that interaction and that sort of it becomes normalized in your day-to-day life, right? And you're only interacting with a group of people that you're surrounded by through your networks of your family initially as a young child anyways, right? So I mean, if they believe deeply in that, then you're always going to be surrounded, and like that embodiment is going to be of that specific group of individuals. And as you get older, you're still going to be surrounded by the same group of individuals. Your networks might grow, not to say it's not going to, right? But when you go back to marriage, or when you go back to another thing, it gets bounded once again.
So it gets reinforced.
Yeah.
Okay. So you think when it comes to, are there other instances other than marriage, do you think, where it comes into play that you've heard of?
Sometimes with friendships, right?
Okay.
And it's interesting because like I've heard specific cases where people be like, oh yeah, that group of people, they're just naturally like that. And I'm like, what? Right? And like, really? Like, and who's taught you this? Who said this to you, right? Oh yeah, they talk like that, you know, like they always say even from back home that, you know, and then they bring up those situations and scenarios that, you know, their grandparents have talked about, their parents have talked about, and it's almost like, wow, so you don't want to associate yourself with this group or, you know, these people because they're from this place and, you know, their upbringing has been like this, and due to that, that's what's made them this way.
Sindhujan, do you have anything to add to that about the idea of knowledge about one's own caste identity in the networks that you know?
I think the point that Arani raised, I think that she was very right in saying that there's some sort of forms of kinships and social relations that, and when we look at the way the diaspora is already formed, it's a very upward stratified diaspora, and only people with a particular kind of background, physical background, economic background, which was also often very caste related, were able to leave the country and come to particular kind of environments like Canada or Europe. And you can see that there has been a sort of pre-selection that happened, and so you will find very much caste pure kind of circles of people who surround themselves, who will basically stick to each other, to their own company, and eventually will also marry within their own kind of endogamous kind of group. So in a way, you can see that caste still functions. It's just like a much more silenced kind of way. And in my research, I also asked the question of how many people actually were aware of their caste background, and 73% of those people who participated in my research were aware of it. And you could see that the awareness degree was much higher amongst those who actually come from so-called low caste backgrounds. And 55% of them were also like aware of who their friends and the people in their immediate circle, like what kind of caste background they would come from. And 45% were not. So it pretty much tells you that a lot of people are actually aware of where they themselves come from, and also the people they're surrounded with, whether it's by geography or whether it's actually by caste.
So let's come back to your study again. Now, I know that you just said that within the respondents of your study, over 70% were aware of their caste identity. Just to place that in context, I've also read somewhere or heard you say, I think in a talk that you did, that there were some constraints on the type of respondents you had because it was an online study. Can you speak to that?
Well, the type of, basically, it excluded a particular kind of population which was not very internet savvy, which had a particular kind of age group, and which was also, like, their educational degrees might not have been to the same level. Because in my study, basically, participants were highly educated, they were highly westernized, and they were also like their formative years they've mostly spent their formative years in the diaspora, and they've also are pretty much from a young age group. So you could see that the online survey in itself had its limits, and you could see how it impacted basically my survey itself. Yeah.
Interesting. So let me put this to you, Arani, because I've heard from other people and just from some of the work that you do that people have shared stories with you about, I mean, women and men here in Canada have shared stories with you about some of the things that they've experienced because of caste discrimination. You know, without naming names, are there any sort of stories that you can share with us?
When it comes to personal relationships, I have sat down and spoken to individuals who've been in relationships for a number of years, and then due to the caste backgrounds or due to the family acceptance of, you know, their significant other, they weren't able to continue that relationship. And so that relationship had to be cut off on the basis of caste, right? And which to me is that is one of the biggest forms of discrimination, right? Because we come from an oppressed community, right? And we also come from a community that's been liberated in the sense that, we've moved into the diaspora. We're very, very prominent in the way we've grown, right? Internationally. And then to hear stories like this, it's almost devastating, right? And those are instances where like individuals would literally not be able to continue a relationship because they'd either have to choose their family or the girl or the boy, right? Like vice versa. Or where they do get married, leaving behind the family, and the family would never accept them back. And for years, they would not even speak to their children, right? Which, I mean, there's no explanation beyond the fact that they could be educated. They could be very well-educated individuals, who have great reputation in the community. But regardless of the fact that they went against their parents' say and married a person of a different caste, was the only reason why their children are being rejected, right, and put aside.
So is this something that's more recent? Do you see a change? Do you see a decline in these kind of conversations you're having, or do you keep still seeing this?
I wouldn't say there's a decline. I think that it's still very prominent because when it comes to marriages, brokers, like, day-to-day interactions even, everything seems to have some sort of a control, right? And I think we would be lying if we'd say that our lives haven't been shaped around these very normative values as well, because it's been normalized, right? And because we've been sort of inhibited towards that sort of understanding from a very young age, that without our own knowledge sometimes we act upon it, right? And so it's not that it doesn't exist, it does exist, right? And the way we would be able to overcome it, maybe in the next, couple of years. But I'd say in order for that to happen, we would need more shows like this, of course, but we would need more of a construction to break these barriers, right?
Do you think that when it comes to, so we've talked about, obviously the relationship that you talked about were two people that fell in love of their own accord and got together. My assumption, therefore, is that there's more investigation into caste identity with arranged marriages. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, for sure. Like, when it comes down to, like, marriage and people getting arranged marriage especially, right? There's, like, a whole list of regulations that they need to, like, make sure, one would be, like, the caste is first, right? Because when they look, they say, we're looking for a person of this particular caste, and then the education would be the next thing, and the appearance of the individual. It's normally girls that get passed on to brokers, right? So it's like that appearance, that sort of, the embodiment of the family. There's so many things that an individual then starts to look at, right? And the families are very keen on, like, there's been instances where I've heard, oh yeah, everything matched with this family and everything was fine, the girl's beautiful, but the cast is a little different, so we're kind of hesitant on, like, making a move towards whether we should or shouldn't. But my daughter's getting older, my son's getting older, I don't know if we want to let this go and continue searching. And I'm like, really? Like, everything seems to be right, and the one thing that you guys still need is the approval of society. Because even if they're okay with it, I find, even if families have, like, progressed, their fear is more so about what their parents might have to say, what the older generation might have to say, and what society, like, what their network of people would have to say, right?
It's interesting. You mentioned things about travel stories. Have friends shared travel stories with you where they've experienced that?
Like, I went to Sri Lanka and came back as well, right? And, like, we were just talking in general, and somebody said, like, they went to visit a neighbor's place because, there were kids there and they just wanted to play. And then their grandmother wouldn't let them. And I was like, oh, why? Oh, they were of lower caste. And then, people in the village would start talking differently. And even the person, so when the individual had gone over to the house, that person in the house was kind of like she didn't know what to do, like, and was a little, like, hesitant on even inviting them in because she didn't want to be shunned down by the community for doing such a thing either.
Well, you heard it there. We have more to talk about. Sindhujan's going to stay with us, and so are Arnie. And we're going to take a break now. You're watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. We're speaking about caste in the diaspora with Sindhujan and Arani. Welcome back to the show, guys. So Sindhujan, my question for you is about your research. I'd love to hear about what your research shows with regards to when caste actually plays a part in interactions and what part it plays.
Okay. Well, my research shows that caste mostly remains to be invisible in most diasporic lives until the person reaches their marital age. So the importance of caste rises proportionally to the attainment of the marital age. So my research also shows that it's less to be found, the caste kind of consciousness is less to be found within the person immediately concerned with the question of marriage, which is the younger person, but it indicates that it can be located within the family itself, which often exerts forms of social pressure to enforce endogamy, so basically marriages within one caste, to avoid caste impurity. So when we look at numbers, for instance, my research shows that 91% of the marriages, the parental marriages, are themselves endogamic, which means that all of them have married within their own caste, and which also includes those people who are of young age who married and participated in my study. And as such, you can see that the caste system itself functions really well, even in diaspora, and this has found its ways into the diaspora with the new technology as well through online matrimonial sites, which stratify and classify according to caste identities and caste marriage preferences. So to speak, marriage has become the prime playground for caste identities and discrimination. And many people will, however, tell you that it only happens within the marriage, by way of saying that marriage has no larger social meaning or implication within Tamil culture and society as a whole, which is very much removed from the reality that we know and we live in. So the heteronormative idea of marriage and family as an institution has this huge social value that also reflects in a stigma when you're not buying into the idea of marriage. So which also reflects upon how important it is to uphold these endogamic kind of marriage patterns, and they also reflect a kind of sustenance of caste lineage preference that can be equalized to a racial lineage, because you, in a way, also like try to purify the bloodline by marrying only within your own caste group.
Now, did your research have any insight into whether it plays a part in business relationships?
Yeah, there were a couple of instances where you could see that caste discrimination happens in the employment sector as well. So especially like when you see like how the Tamil community has established themselves, have set up a lot of businesses and have successfully run these businesses and also employed fellow Tamils, you could see that there's preferences in who they employ and what kind of relationship they have towards these people. And there were instances where people were basically telling about how they were discriminated at their work, especially in restaurant kind of atmospheres where a lot of people have sort of assumptions where these people who work in the restaurant industry come from, and whether they're pure people or whether they're impure people, whether it's actually good for someone from a particular caste to eat in that restaurant or whether to avoid it. So there's been issues that have, especially from Canada, from respondents who actually came from Canada, who were talking about how in the employment sector there were issues of caste discrimination as well, which were much more subtle and much more discreet, and in that way also like harder to uncover.
Interesting. Do you think there were any generational differences? I don't know if that was something that you noted in your study.
I think there are generational differences. So when you look at how younger Tamils who grow up in the diaspora have less knowledge of their history, of their identity, their Tamil identity, and also their cultural identity and their geographies back in Sri Lanka, which means that their consciousness of is much less than the ones of the parental generation. So when we look at the case, for instance, that happened in Canada, of a father driving over his daughter because she was falling up with someone with a low caste background, we can see that traditions are imposed and controlled by older generations who try to retain their cultural practices and enforce them upon younger people. So the case in itself might be very extreme, maybe from our experience or from what we hear and see in our everyday lives, but it's less so of an anomaly in back home as well as here, where intercaste relationships and marriage are still unusual. And my research also shows that the pressure exerted by the family itself by the family itself, which are often like older family members who come from, who grew up and spent their formative years all in Sri Lanka and were basically like ingrained with these kind of heritage of caste mentalities. But in other cases, you could also see that there is a certain part of society, a younger population, which is also has accepted and normalized and socialized.
Oh, I think we just lost Sindhujan. Unfortunately, this is what happens. We like Skype and we use Skype, but once in a while we have difficulties with it. So while our technical folks work on getting Skype back on, I'll put a question to you. So there was this actually a phenomenal work that the Globe and Mail did in 2011 on this idea of caste in the South Asian diaspora. And they interviewed Annie Namala, who's a Dalit activist. Wonderful series, but this is something that she had to say. She said, the Indian diaspora has also not been able to shake off caste, particularly when it becomes a matter of engaging across the touchability line. There are reports of discrimination against Dalits even amongst the diaspora. So, I mean, that they're talking about on an Indian perspective too, right? So let's come back to the Tamil Canadian perspective. Do you think that diaspora has been successful in breaking free of this idea of caste?
No. I say that because we haven't moved past that barrier yet. Unlike Sindhujan said, there's a larger, older generation that still exists, and those norms and those ideas are still very imposed on our day-to-day lives. The tradition is something that, although we're not aware of it from a young age, right, especially being, you know, we're more engaged in a Western society, right, yet the household is more traditional for us, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, we haven't broken that barrier, because to us, when it comes to marriages, and like he said, the study clearly shows that a large number are still aware of their caste, right? And when it comes to marriages, those very, like, that system is very imposed, right? I don't want to say like it's very like engraved, but it's very imposed, right? And we haven't broken free from that, in the sense that we are still adhering to our parents' values, and we're still going by their reputation, their status when it comes to their societal status, of course, right? The way that they view their societal status to be. And just that very reputation that we don't want to sort of take away from them.
I think, oh, we have a caller, okay. And we have apparently Sindhujan online, which is great. So why don't we take our caller first, and then we'll take Sindhujan back online. How innovative of him to try to call on a phone line, the old way people used to do it. So let's listen to what our caller Fidel has to say. Please go on ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, both of you.
Thank you for calling. Go ahead with your question.
In this kind of society in Canada, if anybody discriminates, should we apprehend or just walk away from it or deal with it? What would you do? I mean, I just want to know what's the best way to deal with it.
And I'm definitely going to get an answer to that. So, Fidel, I'm curious, is your question based on either yourself or your friends having an experience that made you think of this?
Well, as a friend, yeah. Well, one of my friends having this kind of problem, when they go into the society, there are some kind of, not everybody does know about him, but the villages or the township he was living in Sri Lanka, they knew about his caste and they tried to discriminate, or kind of attitude changes when they see him in that kind of community. So he just don't know how to deal with it. He get upset, he go home and he worry about it. But I'd like to know, how would you, because you guys seem to be having some idea what's going on. So you might have an idea in this community too. So I'll appreciate if you can give me an idea.
That's actually, that's a fantastic question, and wasn't even something that I thought of asking them. So thank you for your call, and we're going to actually address that. So in the meantime, I'll get our team here to put Sindhujan on the line, and I'll start with you, Arnie. So what do you think someone should do when they face, I mean, in a case of employment,
Right.
or in any of those situations, if they're facing caste discrimination, what do you think they ought to do?
Personally, I think you shouldn't run away from the problem. because it is a problem. It's at the core, right? I think that if you're being discriminated, then one must start standing up for themselves, right? And it's a lack of education and knowledge. Like the caste system barely means anything. It didn't stem from our roots. It's not a part of our actual upbringing. And so nobody should feel like they need to adhere to something that is just a concept that's been imposed on them, right? And that's something they don't even control.
So you would actually confront, you would recommend to a friend that they confront.
Of course.
So what have you told your, a friend of yours who's a girl or a guy who comes to you and says, my other half wants to end this relationship because they think the difficulties pertaining to caste are too much. What would you say to them?
I'd say, you know what, then you don't need a relationship like that, right? If a person can't value you for who you are and stand up for you, that means that they'll not stand up for you when it comes to anything, because this is a very minor aspect of your life.
This is a very interesting question.
Right?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a confrontation, right?
And I think that you need to start stepping up. Like, are you going to let somebody just step on you? Like revolutions throughout the world, when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to our rights, we haven't fought and got this far for nothing, right? And so if we're always going to be silenced, then that silence almost becomes accepted even within ourselves.
This is a hard battle.
Right.
This is, regardless though, as much as I want to, we both probably want to say to a level that confronting, but it's also a very difficult thing to do.
It is also because you come from another aspect, right? Like I was never faced with that personally. So when you're given an upper hand, you don't really know how people have ever felt. I can't speak on how individuals... On
behalf of someone.
Exactly, right? And so for me, it's easy to say if that happened in front of me, I would definitely stand up for an individual. And I would never let a conversation like that go on further. Like in my own households, right? Like to my grandparents, we have had these conversations. My parents do not speak to them with regards to it because they have a fear. But when me and my grandfather argue, he no longer brings that kind of vocabulary into our conversations.
Interesting.
Right?
That's an interesting way to even talk about small level conversations.
Exactly.
So let me put this to Sindhujan. Do we have Sindhujan on the line now? Okay, great. Can you hear me okay, Sindhujan?
Yeah.
Great. So we've got a question from a caller that I really like this question. So he's asking if, you're out there and you face, I think he's had a friend who's had this, face discrimination of some kind. Let's even say at a place of employment because of caste. What are the next steps you think this person should take?
Do you mean the person who's seeing it or the person who's actually involved, who's actually being targeted?
Let's start with the person who's actually being targeted, because that's the more difficult position.
I think it depends in a way, because especially like in the Western context, there's very little legal recognition to caste discrimination. So it's difficult for a lot of people to even pursue it in a formal institutional kind of way and pursue justice. So and that's also like the issue that's now ongoing in the UK, where there's people, anti-caste groups and Dalit groups who struggle for legal recognition for caste discrimination to be given the equal legal status as to racial discrimination and gender discrimination, sexual discrimination. And I think in contexts like Canada, where this debate has not taken the same kind of turn, it's difficult to actually like achieve justice. And it's in a way, I think that it's also a question of privilege. For a lot of people, it's very difficult to actually come from a particular stigmatized background to actually speak up because of the way how they have been taught to never challenge these kind of norms, to never fight against these norms, and then also like the backlash of what you would expect from the larger community, in the sense that how will you react towards you being exposed as coming from this background? How will general society relate to you from that point of view on? So I think for someone who comes from a very privileged background, it's easy to say that they want to step in, they want to help this person, they want to regulate whatever justice or whatever equality he needs to become. But for someone who actually has suffered from it, it's very difficult to also simply straight out resist and also fight against, especially in a context where there's no legal recognition, no political, and also no social recognition from the inside of the community as well as from the outside. So you have difficult struggles, and that you need to fight on different front ties.
Mm-hmm. It's a great answer, and I think the situation that Sindhujan is referring to is the decision that was passed by the House of the Lords in the UK to include caste discrimination as to give it sort of legal recognition. And this hasn't been passed in the House of Commons, but it's definitely very interesting, because if it happens, I think it's the first time outside of Asia that caste discrimination is being legally recognized. Anyway, we'll be watching that for sure. Looks like we're actually at the end of this conversation. So Fidel, I hope we answered your question. I'm just going to add one little thing to that. If you do know of someone that is experiencing relationship difficulties because of caste discrimination, I don't think any of us can purport to be great advisors, but I always recommend a relationship counselor. Similarly, if it is something on the employment side, you can seek someone in HR, or if you feel a lawyer, but sometimes even an HR counselor is someone that can help, because they actually may be aware of other situations that they can draw upon to help you out. Sometimes just going to your friends and family is not enough. Thank you both of you for being on. It's been very insightful. Looks like we have to yet again arrange another time to continue this discussion. Thank you again. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula. Stay with us. We're going to be back to talk about this wonderful documentary, which is coming out with a part 2 called Shadism. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. My next guest is Nayani Tyagaraja. In 2010, Nayani released a short documentary called Shadism to much acclaim and attention. It was about the different values given to fairer skin versus darker skin. Thousands and thousands of views later, she's preparing to work on a longer feature on the same topic. A storyteller, writer, and artist, Nayani is a graduate of the Ryerson School of Journalism. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. So, you know what? I think our viewers would love to know what the original Shadism was about.
So it started in 2009. It started with a conversation with my niece, which sort of inspired the idea. And then I had gone back to South Asia for the first time in December of 2009. I was in India doing some work with a Dalit organization in Bangalore, and then we were in Mumbai for some time. And being in Bombay, which is the center of Bollywood, you're saturated with Fair and Lovely ads are everywhere. Billboards, television, in between movies, like anywhere you go, you see it. And so I had seen those products growing up, and I had seen them on Tamil television.
And let's be clear what Fair and Lovely is. It's an actual cream that is all over India.
Yeah.
That people people try to put on to get fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over India and it's all over the world. It's actually run by a company called Unilever. Oh. In India, it's Hindustan Lever. And they're also the people who do the Dove campaign for Real Beauty. So if you look at the two different types of campaigns, it's really interesting look at the beauty industry. Anyways, that product is all over the world now. It is in Africa and the Caribbean, in Latin America, in South Asia. And so with that documentary, seeing that, I guess, being satirized by those images, I came back and it was my final semester at Ryerson. You had a term project. It was a television documentary. We were supposed to do another idea, it didn't work, so then I said, well, there's this issue about skin color in our communities, and everyone, it was sort of very new to everyone because there weren't a lot of people of color or indigenous people in my program, and people hadn't heard of it, so we decided to take a tackle at it, try it out.
So explain the word shadism to us.
Shadism it speaks to a hierarchy and discrimination that happens based on skin tone within indigenous and communities of color around the world. The idea that if you have lighter skin, or what we call quote-unquote fairer skin, which is interesting because that is a connotation of that being something that's fair and just, which is horrible. And so it's this idea that if you have lighter skin, you are considered more beautiful. It is considered a positive sign of power. It plays out in different ways, but that's sort of the gist of shadism. And it's also called colorism, and in the Caribbean, pigmentocracy.
Now, pigmentocracy, let's get to that. That was actually a new word that I learned by watching that documentary. Now, now you're going to take this on to I mean, the first one was so well received, so you're now taking this to a longer feature. Why?
Originally, I had the idea to do a feature documentary, just because I think a feature documentary or even a series, really, we toyed with that for a while, that idea, that because you need to have more context and more of the story, and I feel like the initial documentary or short did a good job for that time of touching on the topic, but not really digging into those individual stories. For example, like, you didn't really get to see the family histories behind most of the women. You heard Nadia's story, who's from Bangladesh, but Jade, for example, is from Trinidad, and she has ancestry that's West African, Indian, Chinese, Venezuelan. Like, so it's a very complex story for her in and of itself. And so the feature documentary just seeks to dig deeper into the individual stories. We also have a few new women. We did a new group discussion to look at it from a more global perspective than it was originally, and to look at the histories, the diverse histories of slavery, indentureship, colonization that has impacted Jadism for so many different...
And how it has played into this concept.
And how it's both diverse but also similar by nature of European colonization.
And I think I told you this earlier, that when I heard about your documentary, I remember in the place, we used to live in Nigeria before my family, women used to actually, because they didn't get things like Fair and Lovely, they used to use like pure bleach on their skin, and doctors would warn about how it thins your skin, it's very dangerous, and people would still do it. These beautiful women, just because they wanted to get fairer. And there's actually sort of health issues that come about.
Cancer is a very real thing that comes from a lot of these bleaching processes, right? And dermatologists will talk about that. And it's something, that idea of using like household bleach or bleach that you use for your white clothing, like that stuff is used around the world. There's people who still use that because they don't have access to these sort of lightening creams that don't always really work in general. But it's this idea, this power structure that's been constructed of lightness being better, and so a lot of people will do anything they can to achieve that. And that bleaching is, I mean, in Jamaica right now there's a huge thing called cake soap, and it's so similar to bleach, and it's used by very popular musical artists. I mean, my friends from Angola, there's a town where people don't come out during the day because almost the entire town has been bleaching. So it's almost as if as soon as the sun goes down, everybody comes out because their skin has thinned so much. And she was there for a while earlier this last year, and she said people don't even come out during the day. So this is, I mean, it's one thing here in the diaspora, and then when you go back to like so many different homelands and in small rural areas even, it's so big.
It's so concentrated, right? But I mean, so let me first ask you about the documentary, because I know we'll get calls about it if I don't. So the second big feature, I mean, you're raising funds to do this now. Tell us about that. If people are watching and they're interested in supporting you, how can they?
Well, we're doing an Indiegogo campaign. What's interesting about the internet now is you can do these crowdfunding campaigns, and people who support you around the world can support you monetarily or by even just spreading the word, which is the most important thing. So we're running an Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign. We're in our last week right now. It ends next Sunday, and we're trying to raise $15,000 for the post-production, which means the completion of the film. But also, we're a lot of the women in the film, we work in community arts and community programming and grassroots organizing, and so we're doing a self-care toolkit, which provides a few exercises, activities people can do before watching or during or after the film, because the content is so triggering and traumatizing. So we've been working with a counselor to develop that, and so to be able to pay her for that work. And also for an educational curriculum, Shadism is now in a grade 9 and 10 textbook about personal experiences, so it's coming into the school system. So to be able to create like a 1 to 2 class workshop that can be used in schools but also in community settings, to have these discussions with young women of color and young men of color around, and also those who are not exposed to it in the same way, about Shadism.
Is there a website that people can go to?
Yeah, it's www.shadism.com.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And we're going to be playing a little bit of your clip at the end anyway.
Okay,
so
cool.
And there'll be information on our Facebook. You can call us too if you need more information. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you this question because we didn't get a chance to actually show this clip at the start, but you were motivated by a discussion that you had with your young niece. How old is she, and what did she say to you that drove this whole, what has become now kind of a passion of yours? Right?
She's about She's turning 8. Just a discussion that really spoke to her experience of feeling like she wasn't pretty because her skin was darker and her skin tone was darker.
And how old was she when she said this to you?
She was about 3 or 4 at that time. So it's really interesting, like, to look, and I've had experience not just with her, but like a lot of my friends from different communities have had similar experiences, both themselves and their friends, and young ones in their lives, about this idea before you're even able to reason, before a child has even developed those reasoning abilities, they also have developed this acceptance of something that's a truth to them and something that is going to matter for a long time, for the rest of their lives in different ways. And it's really sad to see that at such a young age, it's something that you just accept as normal, and we all do it, we normalize so many different issues. And so yeah, it was a conversation with her, and that really showed me, it really took me out of my comfort zone, I guess, in thinking that it was a normal thing and something that just happens in the community, and then saying, oh, this is something that's continuing with the next generation. We have to really start talking about this.
And we have to change it.
We have to change
so
it.
what has your experience been, and this might just be my final question to you, but what has your experience been around Shadeism in the Canadian Tamil community? Like, how do you think it plays out?
I would say, I think it's really important to position yourself. So I would say in my context, in my experience, I'm neither on either end of the spectrum. I've always fallen somewhere in the middle. So it's sort of, you get this privilege or this pass, right? Like being mid-tone, I think, in any community. And I can say I can only also speak to my family and my friends that I've grown up with as opposed to the community at large. But there is a definite pass that I got for a long time, and a privilege with having lighter mid-tone skin and straight hair. There's all these things that play into our facial features, hair texture. And I think that it's something very real. In some families it's very direct. I've seen it just said out loud and like clear as day, like, you know, if you're darker skin, it's not a good thing. And then in some families it's a lot more subtle. When you get to like these ages of marriage and stuff, it also becomes important. But I think it's something we see at a really young age. If it's not happening to us, it's happening to somebody in our family.
And it's not even just I mean, to take it one step higher, it's not just I used to think it was a Canadian Tamil thing until I came to this country and realized magazines were actually whitening people.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a lot of mainstream media and a lot of artists and celebrity culture, I guess, right now. And yeah, one thing is, like, you see a lot of changes in magazines in terms of coloring. They definitely alter pigmentation in magazines, and you see that with big stars, I guess, in this kind of, like Beyonce, for example, that happens to her a lot. And then you also see it in the products, because if you go into, I mean, we're not immune to it in Canada. It's not just in Tamil stores or Indian stores or Jamaican stores. It's in Shoppers Drug Mart. There are, I mean, the wording isn't the same, but when you see words like brightening or lightening, those products exist in mainstream stores too. So the beauty industry at large has a big part to play in perpetuating this issue continuously throughout the world, and all of them play a role in it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This is so interesting. We want to see what happens when it's done too, and hopefully you'll be able to come back then.
And we can start to shift things as a community.
Yeah, let's shift things as a community. That sounds like a good plan. Well, there you have it. We were just sitting down with Nayani to have that conversation, and wanted to share some final thoughts for today. As we prepared for the show, we watched a clip that Nayani had on one of their sites about her young niece expressing her discontent with her skin color, and it made the team here quite sad. There's no other way to describe how we felt that there are children out there, young women, young girls, that feel this way. We would like to join our voices in with the others who say that this kind of thinking and discrimination and such is, well, ridiculous and must change. Please take a moment to visit their site, www.shadeism.com. It sounds like an amazing project to discuss this issue and support their efforts. We will leave you with a clip about that project. Thank you all for joining us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja.
Don't become a victim of the value system that this world makes for women. Make a value system of your own which protects women.
We've been implicated in an age-old power struggle, privileging some over others. We're tired of this. We're tired of being told our melanin is too much or too little. We are tired of being told that we are wrong for the way we were born. We're tired of being othered, of being stereotyped, of being caricaturized. We are tired of the system that seeks to break us down as peoples based on this beautiful and natural element that we share. As June Jordan taught us, I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. We are not wrong. We were birthed into this world on purpose in this beautiful skin we're in. And to believe in our own beauty again, to believe that we are worthy of our own love and of each other's is our right. It is our right.
தரணியெங்கும் தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.